This is Garrett Cook. I'm back with you. I'm joined today by Dr. David Clawson, who's come up with this latest book called Threat versus Safety Theory. And we're going to take a couple of minutes to talk to Dr. Clawson about that. Hey, welcome, Doc. How are you doing today?
Very good. It's a beautiful day in paradise.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Hey, let's just start at the beginning. What is threat versus safety theory, and how did it emerge from decades in medicine?
Yeah. Well, I want to make it simple, but I first want to state that although I've had a career in medicine, I don't think it emerged just out of medicine. It's something that's evolved out of a lifetime of experience. And I also want to say that it's something that I'm not even sure that was completely cognitive on my part. A lot of it just sort of happened over time. As we got into COVID and I had more downtime, I guess, but some of the specifics of who suffered from COVID and how they suffered played a part in solidifying this theory. So, with that as a background, I think to make it really simple, and it is at its core really simple, but when you start digging down, it gets extremely complex at an environmental level, a genetic level, physiologic level. But just the very simple statement about threat versus safety theory is that it proposes that when we are in states of threat, we are inflamed and we're catabolic. And when we're in states of safety, we are not inflamed and we are anabolic. So inflamed, catabolic, not inflamed, anabolic. Now, let me define catabolic. Catabolic is we're essentially using our own tissues for fuel. So we're breaking down our own tissues. And when we're anabolic, we're building tissue. And so we can think of Hulk Hogan, Arnold Schwarzenegger taking anabolic steroid hormones. That anabolic means we're going to build tissue. Um, so, I think these two concepts, inflamed, not inflamed, catabolic, anabolic, are really important to digest because one of the things we've done in medicine is we have correlated a lot of different diagnoses with chronic inflammation. And so inflammation is in our paradigm of chronic disease, disability, pain, and suffering. Um, the thing that we fail to incorporate into this is the metabolic pathways that go with being in threat versus being in safety. So if you think about being in threat, and you have to mount a defense and use the military, for example, logistics in the military, they've got, bombs and jets and tanks and ships and motor vehicles that they have to mobilize in a defensive response or an offensive response. Now, um, they if they fail in their planning in their logistics to figure out how they're going to fuel all of this defense armament, then they're going to fail in their mission to defend, the homeland. So I think that's what's so critical to recognize is that when we're in threat, we make a significant shift in our physiology to start using our own energy stores, which are essentially our tissues, for the defense response. And when we get back into safety, the inflammation, all the bombs and the guns and everything are put away, and we shift our metabolism into an anabolic mode. So in one mode, we're degenerative, right? has implications for chronic disease, disability, pain, and suffering, also aging. And in the other mode, we're anabolic, and we think of things like growth and regeneration. And, also there's emotional components to those different physiologies as well. So that was a long way to answer a simple question. But again, just to reiterate, threat, inflamed, catabolic, safety, not inflamed, and anabolic.
Okay, so for a summary, make sure I got this right. If somebody's listening and isn't as educated in medicine, it sounds like what you're saying is that the more that we're in safety, however that is perceived in the physiology of our body, the more likely we are to be healthy. And if we are more in threat we are, the more likely we are to experience some sort of chronic health issue. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be correct. And let's add in there, the more we are in safety, the more likely we are to be healthy and happy. And the
Yeah.
Yeah, and the more we are in threat, the more likely, particularly chronic threat. Uh, I'll finish this point, come back to something. Particularly chronic threat, the more likely we are to be unhealthy and unhappy, angry, anxious, depressed, in despair, numb, things like that come with chronic threat. And also, let's make this point now, because this is so fundamental to the theory. Is the way we tend to view life is on our planet, right? Is we're made up of cells, and these cells have membranes and potentially cell walls around them. These cells have a boundary, and so that identifies a sense of self, right? Not just in human beings, but go back 4 billion years ago to the literal advent of life on the planet. Those simple, bacteria back then also have a sense of self. It's not the same sense of self that we do, but they have a sense of self, because if they didn't have a sense of self, they wouldn't know to defend anything. And in that case, the organic quickly becomes the inorganic. The life form will quickly perish. So that's kind of fundamental to the theory. Now, if you think about it, the minute that you have, a, a life form and it has a sense of self, as it goes through its lifespan, it's going to face threat. So threat is inevitable. So I don't want people to misconstrue that, life is going to be paradise, life is going to be utopia, and we can avoid threat. Simply being alive, you're going to experience threat. And we have a genetic code to help us with that threat. But once we have been able to eliminate the threat, defeat it, run from it, hide from it potentially, hopefully it goes away, and we can get back to safety, physiology. We're distinctly different physiologically, so physically, emotionally, socially, mentally, even spiritually, when we move into safety. And I would also argue that we tend to get caught up in our own minds and constructs in our minds that are completely unavailable to any other life form on the planet, right? And so we tend to want to think our way out of our threats, our sense of danger in the world, and actually not do the things that are necessary to eliminate or remove the threats and get to safety. And in my mind, we talk a lot about things like resilience and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think there's a caveat that goes with that. We have two different forms of stress. And one's called eustress, which is kind of good stress for us. Exercising, doing labor, playing. things like that, where we actually do stress our bodies, right? Our heart rate goes up, our respiratory rate goes up. We sweat, we're burning calories, we're catabolic as we're burning some of those calories. Um, but we're not particularly in a state of threat. And so that that kind of stress is good for us. Now, distress is not so good for us. And when it's chronic, it becomes really detrimental to us. We
Hmm.
have to have periods of safety in our life, right? To go back, potentially lick our wounds, but to regenerate and prepare to face the world again that will have threats. Those are inevitable. So in my mind, resilience is a biological thing. It's a physiologic thing, and it's predicated on windows of safety. Whereas, we tend to want to make it kind of an issue of character. If you have strong character, you'll have resilience. I don't think that biologically actually plays out.
Hmm. So that's an interesting thing because in looking at the book, as we have here and going through it, um, it's interesting how you take on some of the traditional norms. And clearly, I won't ask the most obvious question, which is in the movie version of this, it's probably a young George Clooney that will play you. Uh, but in the book, you say the body is not broken, but adapting. Can you kind of unpack that a little more for the listeners? It sounds like you're already talking about more safety leads to more rest and rehabilitation, which and recovery, which is resilience. But how is the body adapting, or is it just the body that has to be adapted?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we're going to go a little deep. I'll try to make it clear and be efficient. Um, Whoever plays me is going to have to be able to ramble in that. So, but anyway, um,
Clooney could do it, but maybe it's Brad Pitt. I mean, you've got the job for it.
Um, anyway, here's the deal: is that although again, getting it back up to kind of the human brain, we think we're very much in control of our lives and sort of the world around us, and in some ways we have dominated the planet. But the reality is, it's the environment, right? That meets the genome, that meets our genetic code that determines what the code is going to transcribe, which ultimately determines our physiology, which ultimately determines, again, how we are physically, emotionally, behaviorally, mentally, socially, spiritually. This soup does a lot to determine how all of those things get presented through our bodies. Um, so I think that the fact that we are operating a lot like other organisms that sort of face the environment and their code makes shifts without this complex, human cortex of the brain makes shifts in their physiology to respond to whether they're in threat or safety. That's a really important concept. So often we think when we don't feel well, right, um, that um, that we have some form of pathology. There's something wrong with us, and we give a bunch of different diagnoses to that, right? So we'll diagnose migraine headaches, muscle tension headaches, things like vertigo or ringing in the ears, difficulty swallowing, chest tightness, dropping out our blood pressure, and feeling like we're going to pass out, having indigestion or constipation or diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome, funny things with our bladder urgency, bladder burning without any infection, abdominal pain, pelvic pain, myofascial pain, meaning muscle and connective tissue pain. And we get all of these different diagnoses, and then we try to apply a pill or procedure to treat these different diagnoses, right?
Hmm.
I think that's a failed paradigm because it's not alleviating the symptoms are the signal, right? Something's wrong.
Right.
We're experiencing some form of threat, and it could be a bacterial or viral infection or something like that, but frequently it's other things in our lives. And what we're doing is our code is changing its expression. So again, going back to the analogy I like to use is, you've got a piano sitting there, and the piano in your living room doesn't do anything, right? It takes a piano player to come in and hit the keys, and it may sound horrible or it may sound really good, um, but nobody can play the whole piano at the same time, every key at the same time, and that would be a total mess anyway. So it's very much the same for our genetic code. Is we're selectively playing the keys of our genetic code, and the piano player is our environment, right? And it's
Hmm.
the external environment around us, but also in humans with this, sort of elaborate brain, and particularly the newer cortex of the brain that I always call the sapio cortex. Um, that is feeding back down into the system, all of our constructs, our narratives, our beliefs, our social requirements, et cetera, are feeding back into the system, so that's kind of our internal environment. And those things then express themselves in our physiology. But, being on the threat end of the spectrum of our physiology, is as normal, non-pathological, as being on the safety end. And when we define that being on the threat end, we go down all kinds of rabbit holes to try to fix or cure people. We give them a laundry list of diagnoses, and they'll be both, physical as well as psychiatric mental health diagnoses. And then we try to, apply a treatment to each symptom. Um, and and so my point always is we're not broken, you know, in the majority of these states. 80% of the of clinical medicine today is in treatment of 80% of the treatments in clinical medicine today are being applied to the treatment of chronic disease, disability, pain, and suffering. And these are what we call phenotypes, the eventual expression of the genetic code comes out not as the whole genetic code, but selective pieces of it, which then is our phenotype, not our, necessarily even our genotype. It's modified. And then that becomes the physiology, becomes the soup that literally bathes all the cells in our body, all the tissues, all the organs in our body, and they're all responding, all the cells, tissues, organs in the body are responding to whether we're in threat or safety. And there are multiple, sort of phenotypes of threat and safety as well. So I think it's really important for all of us, but for patients, for people who are particularly, seeking treatment, um, to recognize they're not broken. It's really important for, clinicians to recognize that the symptoms, they are signals of threat, you know, do something different. And that what we need to focus on is treating the threats, not the symptoms. The symptoms are signals to us. So an analogy would be like a fire alarm goes off, right? And so we have a number of ways that the fire alarm's signaling danger to us. Let's say we're at the office, we're sitting at our desk, and we go, "This is a fire drill. I'm not getting up." I want to get home on time. I don't want to go stand out front for an hour while we do a fire drill. So we ignore the fire drill, right? And then
Hmm.
we're sitting at the desk trying to ignore the blinking lights and the loud noise, and we're a little bit anxious maybe because the fire marshal might come in and go, "Why are you still sitting here?" Or we're even a little anxious because we're kind of going, "Well, this might be a real fire, and I might die here sitting here." And so um, that's kind of the analogy of how we deal with other types of threats in our lives. Like we'll try to suppress or repress threat signaling. We'll try to distract ourselves from it. And a lot of times we just we aren't attending to the signals that our body is giving us, to potentially our own detriment.
Hmm.
Again, kind of again, long ramble there. But to summarize, we need to think about chronic disease, disability, pain, and suffering in terms of our genetic code is expressing itself the way it's designed to express itself when it's in threat or when it's in safety, and we're not broken, right? That we don't have a thing like, and I think that the paradigm in medicine shifted a lot, with the microscope when we first recognized bugs that could infect us, right? And so every illness was you looked for the bug that you could somehow treat with, an anti-bug treatment, an antibiotic to cure it. And we've carried that paradigm forward into chronic diseases, mental health diseases, even cancer. We view as cancer cells as the enemy, like they're, a pathogen that's sort of invading our body. There's a little bit of truth to that, but a lot of cancer is actually just a shift in our own phenotype. Well, it's just another expression of our own cells. It's not that a virus has infiltrated our DNA, but that happens.
Hmm.
And it's not necessarily a mutation, from radiation or something like that. And it's not even a mistake. It's not that our genetic code, somehow made a mistake and we never weeded the mistake out. The majority of it is, again, it's a chronic expression of the genetic code that tells cells, this place is toxic. You need to figure out another plan, other than integrating yourself with this bigger organism. So anyway, I think summary is it's very important to start recognizing that when we get all these variety of diagnoses, there may be a common underpinning to it, the total threat load, and that we aren't technically broken.
Hmm. So, excuse the therapist in me. What I think I'm hearing you say is that instead of it being, and I'm coming from the mental health side, I really heard some of that, uh, sort of that bidirectionality that's common in my area of work of, is it the mind? Is it the body? Is there a similarity? Do they feed off each other? And it sounds like through phenotype, um, and epigenetics, you're saying is that's really more of what's uh, causing some of the chronic illness and disease. And going back to the very beginning of what you said, I wrote this down, was um, it seems like we're kind of chasing our tail on treatment. We're constantly addressing in my field, well, you're depressed, and that's you have these symptoms, which include lower metabolism, all that, and then they may go to a doctor who says, "Oh, sure, you're depressed, but you also have diabetes, or you have, uh, myofascial pain or fibromyalgia." So, are you saying that all of this impacts all of these systems? And
Yeah,
if so, how?
yeah, exactly. So, and again, we'll like, for example, you're depressed. Let's give you a serotonin reuptake inhibitor because you're low on serotonin. We're gonna,
Right.
that one thing, thinking we're gonna fix the problem, and the problem is that threat physiology is is a systemic sort of um, strategy sounds too cognitive, but it is a systemic reaction that every cell in the body is bathed in, right? This
Mm,
physiology, this soup. So we can see that in the brain, it can express as a migraine or, something like, vertigo or tinnitus or even a seizure, but also in the brain, in different parts of the brain, it'll express itself in physical symptoms, visceral symptoms in particular, right? The visceral part of our brain lies right next to our emotional part, so we'll have emotional symptoms, and it all goes together, and that's why you see these clusters of symptoms that tend to run together is because they're coming from the same soup. One doesn't cause the other, right? They correlate with each other because their underpinnings are the same thing. You can have the sort of threat response, the soup related to that causes changes in your gut, in your endocrine
mm,
system, your reproductive system, in your heart, and your heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and in your connective tissues. Actually, makes changes in your bones, but in your muscle and connective tissue. So all of this, it's a big systemic reaction to threat.
So, okay, so let's say you had a client that came in and you saw ongoing chronic um, pain issues. We IBS. So they got irritable bowel syndrome. They've got back pain that can't be explained structurally, and they complain of fibromyalgia. And you do an ACEs. You do a look at what is chronic trauma. And is there trauma earlier that would be an emotional trauma or something like that? Are you saying that part of the treatment plan should be to involve somebody like me, or physical therapy, or I mean, how is there a connection that we're missing between all of these different medical professionals?
Yeah, I would say yes. We need to get out of our silos and not go into the mind-body duality or the cardiology,
Yeah.
gastrointestinal silo. We need to see the whole person. And when we're talking about threats, so this is a simple concept, but when you think about threat, they're generational. They get transferred
Mm,
genetically, right? Even potentially genetically. And then you're going to have historical threat. Adverse childhood events are huge for sort of choosing which part of the code we're going to express. Unfortunately, we tend to carry that out over a lifetime if we don't address the threat load. But also the physical threats, the emotional threats, the social threats, even kind of a concept of behavioral threats, of the things that threat physiology makes us do that can be potentially maladaptive. We have mental threats beyond sort of kind of the concept of mental health, but more in the cognitive world. We have this incredible ability to create constructs, develop narratives, and impregnate our brain with beliefs that are maladaptive for us. We've separated from kind of the environment, and we are frequently under even spiritual threat. And
mm,
ultimately, as human beings that can not only be aware, but be aware that we are aware, and be aware that we are going to die. There's this background of existential threat that we potentially can't escape. So we have to address each one of those levels and see how we can minimize that threat load. And that, really takes not only a team of clinicians with individual sort of expertise, um, medical clinicians working with mental health clinicians, but to really reduce threat load, we have to look at even environmental things like air pollution is going to be associated with, anxiety, depression, anger, asthma, heart disease, other lung diseases, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, dementia, all of that, it all plays in. So we have to look at the whole thing, and ultimately, to be healthy and happy as individuals and as a society, we have to address sort of the socio-political environment we live in as well.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's complicated, right? Simple in concept, but incredibly complicated, at at a at a physiologic level, uh, and all of the different things that happen to us in a state of threat, all of the different signaling and peptides we generate, and monoamine shifts and hormonal shifts, all that kind of stuff. But it's also very complicated, at sort of even a global socio-political level that needs to be addressed at the same time
Sure.
for us
Sure.
all feel safe in the world.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and yet there's aspects that are out of our control. One of the things that may be in our control, I ask you, going back to your education, um, what's changed, and how would you? I mean, how would you change it? I mean, seeing how you were brought up in this field, and then, this is a little bit radical, I assume, for most people. I know this idea in my field would be a little bit radical. What changes would you express in our education of doctors and clinicians in order to implement this?
Threat versus safety theory. Yeah,
What?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Fair enough. And now I feel I was going to make fun of your age, and I didn't. And now after that crack, I feel like I should have. And uh, no, that's a fair point. So in threat versus safety, maybe a better way of going is, what is the biggest shift you've made in your thinking from your original training to today? Would that be a better way of asking that?
Yeah, kind of broadening the aperture, kind of broadening the perspective, and in many ways, retreating back more to what we require medical students to do, to really do
Mm-hmm.
a thorough history and examination, including, getting the background of the family, getting the background of people's childhood, understanding, where they fit into the world in a socio-financial sense, um, and uh, having that piece of information with the constellation of many different, symptoms, um, that Bessel van der Kolk stated that the body keeps the score. And I find that to be very much true. I don't always go directly to adverse childhood events and things like that, or generational traumas, out of the gate with people. But it has to be, kind of within our radar, when we see people presenting with all of these different symptoms and a significant amount of chronic disease, disability, pain, and suffering, as I always say, that this cannot be treated um, like an acute illness, and it cannot be treated like an acute trauma, um, and that pills and procedures are probably not going to fix the problem. So I think that's the shift. But you could even go back a little bit, further. I think what threat versus safety has tried to do is to take a very holistic approach, but underpin it all with biology. Whereas,
Mm.
things like philosophy and religion have some of the similar types of concepts, but what they've failed to have underpinning them is the biology.